Okay. So, first, good evening to all. My name is Guilherme, as you all know, and today I wanted to discuss a subject that is near and dear to my heart. Um, I'm not in any way a professional. I'm not. I'm not even very experienced. I just wanted to bring you something that excites me, that it's something I enjoy doing, and I wanted to share it with you. So today we're going to talk a bit about medieval forging or blacksmithing. I'm going to give you a bit of the history of forging or blacksmithing, and then we're going to, explore a bit how you would forge a sword or something else. So let's begin. First, what is blacksmithing, and when did it come by? Um, Blacksmithing, I would say, is the shaping and treatment of metal to produce tools. So you're going to shape metal different manners with different tools to produce other tools. And it actually appeared a long time ago, around 1500 BC, when the Hittites discovered the process of forging and tempering iron ore. So they discovered how to work the iron ore to make it stronger. The Hittites, they were scattered about 1200 BC, so that knowledge was lost for a while, but it was kind of immediately followed by the Iron Age, which began in 1200 BC and ended in about 600 BC. In the Iron Age, they discovered processes that to produce wrought iron, um, and that was made through a reduction of natural iron ore with heat. So you would heat up the iron ore, and that would remove the impurities that were inside it, that were within the metal. And well, so how did they fare? How was their craftsmanship? Um, the first smiths, their work was kind of inconsistent. It was either too soft to hold shape, so it would bend, and you couldn't use it to hit stuff or something like that. You couldn't subject it to impact. You couldn't bend it too much, or it would be too brittle, so it would crack very easily, or just snap um, into several pieces. So that was a result of lack of knowledge of how to treat the metal. So on occasion, once in a while, one blacksmith would accidentally produce steel, and we're going to get a bit into that later on. But they would produce steel, and they would make much better tools or weapons. And when that happened, it was interesting. Since they didn't know how to do it consistently, um, they would consider that weapon, for example, a sword, a very powerful sword, and they would give it a name, and it would have a whole history behind it, you know, uh, because they didn't know how to replicate it. Uh, so that was, the first, the ancient blacksmithing. Um, you can see here, this image isn't the quality isn't very good, but these are the Hittites. This is a representation of the Hittites. Um, and so after that, after the Hittites, and then after the Iron Age, we had blacksmiths, in the Middle Ages. So what about the blacksmiths in the Middle Ages? How did they fare? Well, they discovered, more about how to heat metal, how to work metal, and the properties of iron. So they, for them, it was easier to produce a better quality material. But that still, wasn't a very very disseminated knowledge. So sometimes it would be weird for the society back then. And that led to some blacksmiths being considered, as practicing witchcraft. And it was it was actually funny. Some of them, I say it's funny, but it's very sad. Some of them were burned at the stake, for practicing witchcraft, just because people didn't know what they were doing to make their metal, so good. But regardless, blacksmiths were valuable members of society. Some of them would be on city councils. They were, if they weren't, they were, regardless, they were influential in their societies, in their towns or their feuds. Because let's remember, the feudal society. And they didn't just make weapons. The first thing we think about when we think about blacksmithing is, swords and armor, tools of war. But blacksmiths don't just produce weapons. They produce many, many things. Some examples are, as you can see here in the image, we have a horseshoe, and that was a large part of their duties, because horses were, very common at the time, and the driving force behind many of the engines they used in war and in agriculture. So producing horseshoes was a very important element of society. They produced nails, forks, anything metal that you needed produced, they would do. So they were very significant in the medieval society. Now, you may be thinking, oh, it's a very important job, must be well paid. It's very significant, for people. I'm going to become an influential person if I become a blacksmith. So, how do I get in on that? How do I become one? Well, to become a blacksmith, you had to find a master blacksmith, and you had to learn from him. And so master blacksmiths, they had apprentices. And there was kind of, you think about competition for jobs as a thing of today, but they would compete to be apprentices back then. So the apprentices, that they had to impress the blacksmiths. Basically, just show that you're a hard worker, that you're skilled, and that you're going to be an excellent blacksmith. And you get picked by the blacksmith, the master blacksmith, and you become his apprentice. Well, okay, good, right? No, not yet. You're not done yet. It was a tough life being an apprentice. You got shelter and food, and you had to work for the blacksmith for 12 years while you learned how to be a blacksmith. So you worked for him and you learned his techniques, and after 12 years, you would earn the right to become a blacksmith, to set up shop. It was traditional for the apprentice to take over the workshop, the forge, from his master, but it didn't always happen. And that was a way they found, the blacksmithing guilds, they found, to not flood the market with too many blacksmiths. So they were exercising some control over the blacksmithing market at the time. And well, you see the same thing today, right? People don't really want to pass on knowledge because they don't want competition. So it's a very, this is something we think is recent, but it's not really. Well, now having learned a bit about being a blacksmith and being an apprentice, oh, can I just grow my hair and get an awesome beard? Because that's what you see most blacksmiths like. They're long-haired, long beards, and just hammering away at a piece of red steel. So can I can I just do that? Let's go, let's do that. Well, it's not really that simple. First, we need to know what to make our weapons, our items from. So, what do you make a sword from, for example? Well, and the answer is steel. You know, you can use other metals. You can use well, people they made swords before the Iron Age. You know, they made swords out of bronze, and there are more modern materials that are more resistant. Titanium is a good material because it's very light, but steel is the most traditional because it was what they could get, and it's stronger than iron. It's stronger than copper or bronze, for example. It's um, it's easier to work than titanium, and so it was a good material for them. So, what is steel? Steel is basically a combination of iron, which is a mineral we saw. So we have iron ore, then you extract the iron from it, and you combine it with carbon. How did they do that time? Well, carbon is present in coal or charcoal. So they would they would mix the two until they had iron with enough carbon to become steel. And so that wasn't really an exact science back then. So you had different grades of steel, different qualities of steel, but they had a hang on how to do it. Today, we have a better knowledge and of levels of carbon that make good steel, and we are we are able to do it more precisely. We don't just mix coal and iron to make steel willy-nilly. We just we do it with measured, and you don't use coal anymore. So when you get higher carbon steel, you have tougher steel. It's more ductile, and it resists fatigue, metal fatigue, which is what causes cracks over time in steel or any other metal. But higher carbon steel is kind of harder to work than lower carbon steel. So when we're beginning to work with metal, especially if we're doing it by hand, we want to work with lower carbon steel just so we can get used to the process and then move on to high carbon steels. For instance, let me just get my presentation here. So for instance, when I first started working with metal, I started with 1020 steel. This 20 at the end of the number means it's got a lower, it basically tells you about the portion of the amount of carbon the steel has. So 20 is a lower end. When you move up to, for example, 50, then you get a better carbon steel. And so that's how we start. We start with 1020, which is easier to work, but it doesn't really become it doesn't really accept heat treating well. But then we move on to harder steels and just more advanced techniques. So, okay, learned about steel. Let's now start forging. So, what do we need to do it? First thing, we need a forge. So, what is a forge? The forge it could be the place where we are forging, but it could also be the name of the furnace that we're using. The furnace is basically bricks or rocks, depending on how traditional we want to be. Then something to make a fire. When the place where I do my forging, we use coal or charcoal or a combination of them both. And the other thing we need is just air. That's the triangle of fire, right? So we have a fuel, air, and heat. So the more air we get in the fire, the hotter it's going to be. So, for example, this picture that you see here is the forge where I do my metal working. And you can see it has bricks around it, and those are barbecue bricks. So they're better for thermal isolation, and they have coal inside it. Actually, this is charcoal, and we mix a few rocks of coal inside to improve the heat. And you can see that the brightest part of the flame is in the middle, and that's because there's a pipe down there that runs through the middle of the forge, and it supplies air to the mixture. So in old times, in medieval times, they would have a bellows, and they would just have the apprentice probably just working that bellows and feeding the fire with air. Now today we have more modern alternatives, so we use an electric blower, and it just feeds air into the fire, and it's more consistent, so it gets us better heat. All right, so heat up the forge about 760 degrees Celsius. The Celsius, they should should be enough, and you just shove the piece of steel inside the coals and wait. That's the first part. That's the easy part. You can see here that in the picture we have this piece of metal in here. This is a knife we were making, and the part we were working on is hidden by the fire because it was the handle that we were working on, and we have to just put it in the hottest part of the fire. So that's a trick, and you just wait and watch because you have to judge it by the color. It's it is. So let's move on. And so we have here a few samples of color. The first picture you can see, it has the tip of the coil. It's more reddish, so it means it's kind of colder. It can be worked that color, but it's easy. It's best if you just heat it up a bit more. And the way it moves is the way the heat relates with the colors is red, dark, dull red. It's colder. Then you move on to brighter red, then you move on to orange, then you move on to yellow, and then you move on to white, and then you move on to a puddle of molten metal. So you have to be really careful when you watch your metal as it's heating up, because if you're not careful, and forges aren't really that precise unless you have a computer-controlled forge, which is it's best, but it's much more expensive. So for our types of forge, for coal forges, you have to pay attention so you don't melt the metal. I have here, I don't know if you're going to be able to see it, but I have a knife here that I made, and this knife was supposed to be, I think, at least 3 centimeters longer, maybe 2. But the tip of it just melted inside the forge, and I didn't pay enough attention. So that's something you have to watch out for. But well, let's say you have a very yellowish color, very bright. So get your tongs and just get it out of there, and let's get to hammering. So now it's time to shape the metal. When metal becomes that hot, it becomes very easy to shape. So you don't really have to put a lot of force into it. It's more about precision. So you don't really need the heaviest hammer, biggest hammer. Sometimes you do because you just want to speed it up. But when you're starting, it's best to be precise rather than just hit it hard, because if you're precise right now, then later on you don't have to correct the mistakes you make. You can see here in the picture that we have 5 different hammers, and they all have different characteristics, different shapes. You have the second one from the bottom has a more rounded tip. So, and the third one from the bottom has a more pointed one, and all of them on the left face, they have their faces are straighter. So you have to remember that whatever shape your hammer is, it's going to be imprinted in the metal when you hit it. So if you want to have smooth metal, you better get a straight hammer, a hammer with a straight face, and hit it as precisely as you can. And that's kind of very hard to do when you're beginning, but it's very good fun. So you're going to shape the metal. There are some techniques for shaping, but they're just they're just names for processes. So when you draw out the metal, you stretch it, the hammer, you make it thinner, but you make it longer. When you upset the metal, you do the opposite. You make it shorter but thicker, and you can punch a hole in the metal. You can fold it over to make stronger metal with layers. Those are all techniques that you can use. People can weld metal plates to one another just with friction when metal is hot. That's also one of the techniques. So there's an infinite amount of stuff you can do with metal. It becomes maybe as pliable as silly putty or something like that. Now, after you've done your shaping, you hammered all your metal. So what's the next step? What are you going to do? Well, now we're going to quench it and temper it. But, well, what is quenching and what is tempering? And what do they do? Well, quenching is that thing you can see on the video. We're going to submerge the hot metal into room temperature oil or some other substance. We use oil for our forging, but there are some people who use water. There are some more modern processes that use air, and there are others that use brine or salt water, right? And when you do that, the metal gets harder. So you have you were working your metal, hammering it, shaping it, and that is a very soft metal because it's it's being warmed up, heated up, and then cooled down very slowly. It's not being that's not a sudden process. So it's kind of normalizing itself. So the molecular structure is very relaxed, and I'm not going to give you technical details. I'm just going to say it's very relaxed. But we don't want relaxed metal. We don't want soft metal, especially when we're working with weapons. So we're going to have to harden it, and to harden it, we quench it, and that creates more rigid molecular structures in the metal. Okay, so we've done that. All right, now we have to be very careful, because when we temper metal, it becomes very brittle, and if we're not extremely careful, we can end up breaking it, just banging it against something or dropping it on the floor. So we have to be extremely careful when we do that, and we have to do something to get that a bit more flexible, to get that metal a bit more resistant. So now we're going to temper it. And the tempering process is kind of the opposite of quenching. Quenching, we do it very fast, so hardens up the metal. When we are going to temper it, we heat up the metal evenly to a temperature, that is not enough to get it soft again, but it gets very hot. We usually do it until it kind of changes color. Let me see. There we are. We have this kind of different color in metal when it gets hot, but before it gets red hot. So, and we kind of want to get to that color, and then we let it cool down naturally. We don't rush the process, and this kind of normalizes the steel a bit. It softens up those molecular structures. So we have steel that is strong. It's stronger than it was before, so it doesn't bend. It doesn't bend permanently. It kind of retains its shape. So you can bend it and it'll just spring back. So that's tempering for you. It's a very important process, because if you don't do it, you just have a metal that cracks at the first sign of an impact. And if you have a sword, for example, all right, it's important that your sword is hard, but it's more important that it doesn't break when you hit something like a shield or another sword. So that's the importance of quenching and then tempering the metal. Okay. Let's see. All right. Now we have soft metal, and we have our sword. It's shaped like a sword, so it looks like a sword. And now what? What's next? Next step? Well, the next step is the finishing touches. So we're going to finish our sword, and to finish the sword, we're going to do a lot of filing. Take a file, take a sander. More modern workshops will have belt sanders, automatic sanders, and that'll make the process much easier. But if not, just take a file and hand file the edge to make the edge of the blade. You have to make the fuller by hand too, so you can't do that with a hammer unless you're very, very, very skilled. And it's still not a good idea to do it with a hammer, because the fuller is that groove in the middle of the sword, and its purpose is mainly to make the sword lighter, so it's not very heavy when you want to swing it. It can't take you off balance. So to make the fuller, you have to take metal off the sword, and if you do it with a hammer, you're just spreading the metal away. So it's important to do it, with a file, and it's a very, very time-consuming process. But it's a process that you can, that it's good for us to, correct any mistakes we made during the hammering part, because especially if we're new at forging, it's going to be very hard to get things right, to get the hammering precise, and to not leave any marks, any strange marks in the metal. I have here, we're not going to be able to see it. I have here a dagger that I made in one of the workshops I went to, and you can see that here near the hilt, it's all irregular. The thickness is all irregular because I wasn't very careful with my hammering. So that's one of the risks. And in filing, in the finishing stages, you can correct all that. It's just going to take a lot of time. But what can you do? If you want if you want something that looks good, you have to go through the motions. That sword that you see here in the picture is actually mine. I made this one. I'll show it to you later. But that's it before finishing. So I had just tempered it, and it was we were mocking the pieces to know what goes where. So you can see that you have here, the blade of the sword. You have the hilt, the guard, actually, to protect your hand. That was a separate piece that we made. And then we need to make the handle and the pommel. Those are those are our pieces that we can make during the finishing stages as well, because they don't have to be tempered. They don't have to be hardened and then cooled back down. But you do it during the finishing stages. All right, so okay, finished our sword, and we have a beautiful sword, or we have a beautiful axe or a beautiful knife. These pictures are kind of terrible, the quality of them, but I wanted to show you the things I managed to to produce. The first thing I've made was this knife on the bottom right corner here, and it's a very basic knife, and it's very low carbon steel, so it's not really very useful. I can bend it with my hands, but it's something. And then the second one I made was this axe, bottom left corner, which is much better, and it's still low carbon steel, but it was a lot of fun to make. And finally, the sword. And the sword is one of the last things I made, and that is high carbon steel, so it was quenched and tempered, and it's good. It's just like a real sword. It's as resistant as a real sword. We found that out when we tested it, and you can see it doesn't really have an edge, so it's not sharp the way the other ones are, because this one is for competitions. And that leads us to, what do you use the things you make? What what are they good for? First of all, don't use that stuff on anyone on the street. Don't cut anyone, please. But one of the things we can do with that material is practicing HMB, which is historic medieval battle. That's those guys in the picture. They compete in medieval battles, which are obviously not in the Middle Ages today, but they compete in full armor and using real weapons. Their weapons are not sharp, and but in every other aspect they're real medieval weapons, and that's part of the fun. I'm not really that into the fighting aspect, because you can get kind of hurt doing that, but it's a very interesting thing to watch. Those guys, they're from Brasilia, and they are the guys who have the forge and where I produce my stuff. It's a very nice gang. Second thing is you can collect medieval weapons. So if you're like me, if you're interested in medieval weaponry or armors, or maybe just everyday stuff that you can make with metal, that's for you. And you can sell the stuff that you make. A sword like that that I showed you, it goes for quite a high price. The guys sell their swords for, I don't know, about $1,000 or more, and it's kind of a good business if if you already enjoy doing it. And the last thing is just if you enjoy making stuff with your hands, which is my case, it's very very fulfilling. It's a very nice feeling to make something out of your own effort. I like it. And I recommend it to anyone who's interested in producing something. And well, that's it. I could there's much more to tell. Smithing is much more than that. You have to know much more. These are only the most basic techniques. And there's knowledge in there that you acquire over years of experience. But I don't have those years of experience to get that knowledge to give you. So I'm just going to leave you with that. This is the most basic, of smithing techniques. And it's a lot of fun if you want to try it sometime. And finally, just some references that I used. I didn't get all of that knowledge from, just what I learned. It's mostly for vocabulary and the names of the techniques, but the website of the Old Field Forge was a very nice reference. They really break down everything very, very nicely. The website medievalists.net, it also talks about the role of blacksmiths in medieval society. So it's very interesting if you want to find out, what they did and who they were in medieval society. And there is the website of the Penn State University. They have an article there that's based on Henry J. Kaufman's metalworking trades in early America. This goes a bit more into the techniques and the names and the processes of forging techniques. So that's a good reference if you want to get a bit more technical. And apart from that, just thank you for your time, and see you next week.